Hello, I'm Norm Warner, and these are Norm's Real Estate Tips. Today we're going to do part 3 of making an offer. I know I said after part 2 that was the end of that particular topic, but I got to thinking afterwards that we hadn't really covered the strategies and options for the offer. We had focused primarily on the process and the forms. So this will focus more on some of the strategies you should look at and pursue while making an offer and some of what your options are. The first thing you want to do, and the most important thing of all, is to work closely with your mortgage rep and your realtor to determine what it is you can afford to offer on this house. The realtor will do a market analysis of the market and give you some idea what the ballpark should be and maybe even give you some advice on it. But you need to work with your mortgage rep to find out if you can really afford that price, and more important, if you have the cash on hand to be able to afford the closing costs that are associated with that price. Closing costs normally work out to be about 3% or more of the offer price. So you need that type of money on hand to throw into the deal for closing costs. Otherwise, you're going to have to ask for a concession, which we'll talk about later. Make sure also that you work with your real estate rep to understand how to structure the deal, whether or not you need a concession. The mortgage person will give you a good faith estimate about what your costs will be, and then you need to determine if you need a concession from the seller to cover some of those costs, some or all of them. It's not unusual for buyers to ask for seller's concession, but we'll see later that it does impact the strength of your offer. So work with your realtor. He'll structure the deal for you and put it in terms of the paperwork that's got to go to the other side. Let's talk now about offer strength, the strength of the offer you make. There's certainly no doubt that cash is king. If you have all cash and you can make a cash offer, your offer will be accepted before all others at the same price, and sometimes even offers that were made with mortgages at a higher price, because sellers love cash. In some cases, cash buyers don't even require doing an appraisal. So that helps the seller out. They don't have to worry about that. In some cases, seller or buyers have been known in cash offers to even waive the inspection. We certainly don't recommend that as realtors, but some cash buyers do that. So cash is king and the number one thing that sellers like to see in an offer. The second strongest offer is a conventional mortgage. Conventional mortgages are strong because they have fewer terms and conditions and onerous conditions than some of the mortgages below them on this list. Conventional mortgages for a while were requiring 20% down, which also showed a lot of financial wherewithal. But these days you can get conventional mortgages with as little as 5% down, so that's not as big a factor anymore. The main factor are the things that they don't contain, which are some of those terms and conditions that sellers don't like. Moving down the list, you have the FHA mortgage. It's the most common mortgage used by buyers these days. You can get FHA mortgages for as little as 3% down, although 5% down is fairly standard. FHA mortgages are guaranteed by the government, so the mortgage companies like them. Sellers don't like them as much because they do contain some provisions or terms and conditions or requirements that some sellers don't want to meet. Normally they are requirements that deal with safety, like having handrails on stairs more than 2 stairs high, and having GFCI plugs in your kitchen and your bathroom so that you don't get shocked if you're anywhere close to water. Some sellers, realizing that their house may not meet those standards, just won't accept FHA mortgages or any of the other ones below us here, since they all contain those provisions. So they view FHA mortgages as a little less desirable than a conventional mortgage. Below that are the VA mortgage and the USDA mortgage. Both of them have even more terms and conditions or other factors that make them a little less desirable. The VA mortgage, for instance, is the only mortgage that still requires that the seller pay for having a pest inspection done to the house to make sure that there's no infestations of wood-eating pests. So some sellers don't like to have to pay for that. VA does not allow the buyer to pay for that. It has to be the seller. So that makes it a little bit less desirable. USDA doesn't have that requirement, but most sellers and sellers agents know that the USDA program basically is aimed at lower income and less credit-worthy buyers. So that makes people who come with one of those in hand a little less desirable than someone higher on this list in terms of the mortgage type that they're using. Last on the list and the least desirable of all is the person who comes with a contingent offer. This is a person whose offer says, I want to buy your house, here's my price, and oh, by the way, I have to sell my house before I can close on selling your house or on buying your house. So the seller is being asked essentially to take their house off the market or to make it less desirable in the market by marking it as contingent, and hope that the seller is able, or the buyer is able, to sell his house. Now, it's possible that you could go 30, 45 days, the buyer couldn't find a seller or a buyer for his house, so he has to back out of the deal. So that's why it makes it so much less desirable. There is a form of this that's a little less onerous, and that is if the sale has already been agreed to, but it hasn't closed yet. So that's a contingency upon closing of a sale. Some sellers will look at that a little more favorably than just a pure contingent offer. So those are the way that sellers might rank the offers that you could come with in hand. Keep that in mind as you're making your plans. Also, let's talk about making requests for special terms and conditions. Anytime you go to a seller with an offer that has a bunch of extra terms and conditions or extra requests, it will make it less desirable than someone who comes at the same price without all of those conditions or terms and conditions. So try to keep extra requests to the minimum or out of your offer altogether. And don't play games. It does nothing but really tick the sellers off when you lowball them. If you lob a low offer in that's 10 or 20% less or 15% less than what they're listed for, it just makes them mad. Sometimes they won't even deal with you again if you decide you want to make a real offer or an offer more closer to their asking price. So don't do that. It doesn't do any good. It just wastes everybody's time, including yours, your realtors, and the sellers. Minimize the contingencies. We've talked about contingencies already. There are some standard contingencies that are in every purchase agreement, such as the inspection and the need to determine if it's in a floodplain, things like that. But you should minimize anything else that you ask for. Anything else you ask for essentially adds risk in the mind of the seller, because if something happens that the contingency is not met, then that means the deal is off. So minimize those contingencies. You could ask for well and septic inspection, but don't ask the seller to pay for that. There's a place on the well and septic inspection addendum where it asks, who's going to pay for this? And it has a spot where you can check off seller or buyer. If you check off seller, you're asking the seller to pay for an inspection that you want, not necessarily that he wants, and maybe an inspection that other buyers haven't asked for. So it puts you at a disadvantage. So just don't ask for things like that, or the seller to pay for things like that. If you want a radon inspection, if you want a well and septic inspection, if you want lead-based paint inspection, you should offer to pay for those things so that it doesn't add to the burden of the seller, and he doesn't start adding up the cost of trying to do business with you. Finally, trust the advice of your realtor when you're trying to put your offer together and set your offer price and terms and conditions. He understands the market you're in. He understands the house he's been with you out there, and he understands kind of your circumstances. So he'll work to get you the best deal he can without at the same time making the offer so onerous that he knows it won't be accepted. And be careful what you ask for. Don't ask the seller to pay for things like we said, the well and septic and other inspections. That just makes them mad. You can ask him for things that aren't included in the MLS listing ticket. But again, that's something, if they wanted to leave it, they would have said that. So if you asked for the washer and dryer and they didn't put it in there, maybe because they just bought a new washer and dryer, they'll probably just reject that and say no. And you don't want them to get too used to saying no to you on things, because then they could just say no to the whole deal. So don't ask for a bunch of things unless for you in particular it's a showstopper. Then obviously you've got to ask for it. One final thing to be flexible on is possession. If the seller has said in his MLS listing that he needs a week or two after closing to get out, to get moved out, don't go in your offer and say, I want possession on closing. You're asking him to solve a problem for you. Maybe you have the problem of you're getting out of a rental apartment or a rental unit or something that you have to be out of yourself. So that's your problem. And now you're trying to make it his problem. He doesn't want to be rushed to get out either. So if you go in and make it a showstopper for you and put the ball in his court that he's got to be out at closing, you're liable to find that you've just queered the whole deal. So don't ask also for pre-closing access. Sometimes buyers will say, can I get in before closing and start doing some of the work I want to do on the house? Don't do that. That would just be an inconvenience for the seller. They're not going to agree to it, and they're just going to, that's going to look bad for you in their eyes. Also, don't ask them, can I bring my stuff and put it in your basement or in your garage? That's not their problem either. That's your problem. You may have to rent a storage unit for a little while to store your stuff if you've got to be out of an apartment and plan to live with a buddy or something for a while till you can get in the house. But don't make that the seller's problem. So these are some of the tips, the strategies, the options, the things you should consider when putting together your offer. As I said at the beginning, any offer that you make will be one that you have to sit down with your realtor and your mortgage person and talk about in great detail. But these will give you some ideas of things maybe you should try to avoid. I'm Norm Warner, and these are Norm's Real Estate Tips. Next time, we'll finally get around to how to deal with those rejections and counteroffers. Thanks for watching.